you, Farah. Great. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. I'll just before I talk about the context, just the format this morning will be 2 short clips from the interview. I think it's just the interview with Jnana. So, and Vajrajyoti and I will have a little bit of short conversation about each clip, and then a couple of questions for your breakout rooms that are actually connected to the clips. So if you've seen the long form interview, fantastic. But if you haven't, actually what we'll be talking about and what we'll be asking you is actually contained in these quite short clips. They're just a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes each. Yes, so just a little bit of context, if you don't already know. I mean, there is quite a lot of really useful information on the web pages, but the interviews were about The Master and His Mystery, which was the book that Iain McGilchrist published in 2009. And it's interesting that although it had popularity almost from the day it was published, something has been gathering over the last 10, 12 years. And there's been some increasing interest. And he has, in the last, say, 4 years in particular, he's done quite a lot of interviews, videos, conversations, and so on. So he's been doing those while he's been researching and writing his new book, which has just come out, which I already thought was quite amazing to be talking about a piece of work that he had been researching and writing 20 years ago, published 12 years ago, 13 years ago now, and he's kind of moving on, but he's been very willing and open to have conversations about the book that has been published. I came across it partly because in our order we actually have someone who is a close friend of his who lives on the Isle of Skye, or has a house on the Isle of Skye in northwest Scotland. So I came across the work via that route, and I've never read the whole book. I've read the first and last chapter so far. I'm waiting for my early retirement to complete it, but I immediately felt it was a work of great importance, almost as important as any Buddhist text that I'd read. And I think even the very short clips that we're showing today at least speaks to me the reasons why I felt it to be so important. I think one of the reasons is that if you know anything about his background, it's quite interesting in that he is multidisciplinary, that he had studied off by, I think he was going to study theology and philosophy, although he ended up reading English at university, then switched to medicine. In other words, he manages to ground himself in the poetic and literary traditions and then study science and medicine. And I think that has influenced his medical journey, and is why he's been able to synthesize some perspectives which very few people have managed to do, I think, in my opinion. So I think any attention given to him is fascinating. And I think there's very strong congruences between his work and Buddhism. In fact, probably any spiritual tradition, as he himself says. So just that's a little bit of context. I think what we're going to do is just play the first clip, and then Vajrajyoti and I will just talk about it for a few minutes. Then we'll play the second clip, talk about it for a few minutes. Then you'll go into breakout rooms and we'll for about half an hour, and then we're going to come back at the end for a sort of a quick tie up at the end. Yep. So I think with no further ado, shall we just get on and play the first clip?
Benefit of those who are listening who may not have read my book. The idea that's encapsulated in the title is that of a wise spiritual master who looks after a community that flourishes and grows, and he realizes that in time he can't look after everything, but he has an even more important insight, which is that he mustn't get involved with certain things if he's to maintain his all-important oversight. So he appoints his sort of brightest and best helper to go about on his behalf and act as a functionary, but the functionary being bright but not bright enough, believes he knows everything, which is always a sign of a fool. And he thinks, what does the master know? I know it all. And he adopts the cloak of the master, but not knowing what it is he doesn't know. He and the master and the community fall to ruin. Now, that when I read that, and I can't remember exactly where I found it, I say I found it in Nietzsche, but when I look back, it's not really that I found in Nietzsche. It's perhaps rather like the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice from Goethe's poem. But in The Secret of the Golden Flower, there are texts that say exactly this, that what they call what I would call the left hemisphere, the analytic mind, it is like a violent general who commands a fierce army from a distance, but the sword must be turned around. And what they mean by the sword must be turned around is that the intellect must understand the limits to the intellect, which it only rarely ever does. But when it does, it can then restore the master, and it actually uses the term the master and the servant, that the left hemisphere equivalent, the kind of noisy analytic intellect, is a very good servant, but a very poor master. And I've also found it in Rumi, I found it in Indian texts. You know, it's everywhere that you look in spiritual literature. There we are.
Well, I think what you're arguing is a wisdom perspective. And you beautifully lay that out in both scientific terms and philosophical terms. But you know, it's an old wisdom, isn't there? That the intellect alone will not teach us about the most important things about being human, and yet we need it. It's so intrinsic to our success as human beings and survival as human beings, and yet it has a place.
Yeah, so that's the first clip. I think the first thing, I'll just ask Vajrajyoti a question, because you had actually read this book several years before I had, and maybe not that long after it was published. And I wonder whether that title, or even the story that the title refers to, whether that in itself had some effect or impact on you.
Yeah, thanks, Lokeshvara. I read it, I don't know how long ago, ages, and I think I read it twice, although I must admit I just found a bookmark in it kind of a quarter of the way in, so maybe I read it 1 1/4 times. It's quite a big book, quite fine print. I find the parable and the title alone very useful, like parables are. They remain embedded in one's mind. And in thinking about that, you know, the parable really is about this, the brain being in two halves, and the left brain being this kind of analytic intellect, and the right brain being more kind of holistic, more poetic perhaps. And I remember back to my very first retreat, which was a long time ago. My very first, it was a retreat near Wellington, perhaps just a weekend. And I came back from that retreat and found myself listening to classical music, which I wasn't really into, and browsing the bookshops for poetry books, which, you know, I did have some poetry books, but I'd never really connected with poetry. And it was like a whole other world opened to me, and that classical music moved me. Some poetry moved me in a way it never had before. And this particular parable and the title of the book kind of explains that. This sounds a bit simplistic in a way, but you know, my work, my everyday life was very kind of intellectual and analytic, and being on retreat enabled the more holistic, poetic part of my brain to switch into action, turn on more brightly, and engage with the world quite differently. And that's, yeah, I keep noticing that in my life, I guess. Meditation in particular, but also being in nature, for me, enables the right side of my brain to come alive more fully, and it's such a relief when it does. And I was thinking, or actually when we've been talking, Lokeshvara, often when you talk about myth, the importance of myth. So I wonder how this parable relates to your kind of emphasis on myth as having value in itself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because probably my journey was a little bit different for you, because my foundation is a bit of I tend towards the chaos end of the spectrum rather than the analytic end of the spectrum. But what was interesting to me, even in that clip, was Iain McGilchrist almost excitement of finding these stories from other traditions that are about his title. So he picked it up from one tradition, but then he found that there were parallel stories from other traditions. In other words, it suggests that the truth that the parable refers to, that he embedded in the title of his book, is an archetypal story or even a universal story. And you can see that he gets quite energized by that idea, because he is trying to point out to us a universal truth. And I didn't know, when I became a Buddhist and started practicing with our community, I didn't know, maybe you get a sense of it, I didn't know that there was this permission to use story and myth as being a Buddhist. And I love that. And I've had some very good training from particularly a very good artist friend of mine, Arloka, and who always talks, about myth and story and even folk stories and fairy stories. In fact, he always mentioned a book to me by Bruno Bettelheim called The Uses of Enchantment that was published in the 1970s. And I've just found a hardback copy of it 2 weeks ago. So that's going to be my reading over the next couple of months. And I think that stories, I think it's a question for me that goes something like, oh, okay, so there is a lot in Buddhism about trying to get underneath experience, trying to get underneath it and get underneath concepts and ideas. But I think, well, there's definitely got to be a place for stories and myths and parables in Buddhism, because they are actually what motivate us. That's what motivates me anyway. That's really that's what makes me want to go beyond myself and even cooperate with other people. So, in a way, I think that's this evocation of the artistic mind, if you like, and being able to practice that as a Buddhist has been very important. And I wonder, just you coming from that analytic background and saying how you started to listen to music, and I wonder how that has played out. And especially, can I bring in an idea of the creative mind, which is even the idea of doing nothing or even allowing yourself to be bored? And have you actually tried practicing that?
Yeah, that's a big, I think that's such a big and such an important topic. McGilchrist makes the point that the left brain likes to be busy. It likes novelty. It's always seeking new experience. It's the left brain that gets you reaching towards your phone or your computer screen, or and the right brain doesn't do that kind of stuff. It's not interested in the latest email or message or whatever. I think it kind of switches off, or gets overwhelmed by this analytic left brain. And I think, Subhuti in our tradition, and Tiratna, and probably many people, but he's been really really emphasized that we need to sit until we're bored, and then we need to keep on sitting. And he doesn't mean sitting in meditation, he just means sitting, doing nothing. But even like for me, even sitting doing nothing on my deck for quite a while, which I do a lot of, there's still a lot to for the left brain to get busy on, like, oh, that needs to be pruned, oh, those chooks need to be fed, or there's tons of left brain activity going on. But what I find I need to do is get away from home, go and sit at Sunasham Loka normally, like in the bush. There's no jobs for me there because I've never been on the kind of team on the ground there, and just really let myself get bored. I think this culture encourages a very low tolerance of boredom. there's so many ways of not being bored, but it's only kind of through, when we sit through boredom, often that's some other experience can open up, something much richer, deeper, and so much more pleasurable and beautiful, you know. I mean, this is a bit simplistic, talking about left and right brain, so apologies in a way, but the left brain, yeah, it just wants to kind of get on with superficial stuff, you know. In his terms, you know, order the armies what to do, you know, organize the world, administrate the world, be a bureaucrat, all this kind of stuff. And what the master realized, drawing on the title, was that if you're doing that kind of thing, you can't do the more important stuff. But for us in the world, we, you know, as spiritual people, and everyone is a spiritual person, actually, we need to develop the capacity to, you know, run our lives, live reasonably functional lives, and deepen into something much more mysterious and beautiful. So, and that's a challenge, you know, that's certainly a challenge. We all need to attend to emails, I'm sure, you know, have diaries, have schedules. So yeah, it's such a loss that we can't find ways of accessing the depths and the beauty. Yeah, and I wonder, you know, I think you've got some thoughts around this left brain world, to use those terms. Would you mind talking about them, Lokeshvara?
Yeah, maybe just before we go on to the second clip. I mean, I was really struck by Iain McGilchrist's hypothesizing what he thought a left hemispheric, or that kind of mode world would look like, and then looking at the actual world and going, it looks rather like as though it's, you know, it's a left hemispheric functioning world or something. So I must admit, when I started to read him, it was based on, I was already a bit concerned over several friends and family, like my stepmom, for example, was working in the NHS in England, which is the National Health Service, and several good friends of mine were teachers. And over about 10 years, all of these ways of measuring their performance were coming in. Some of that, look, you know, on the face of it, you thought, oh, it's probably quite helpful, annual reviews and so on. But people were being, there were quantitative measures that people were being, their performance was being measured on. Something just didn't sit right in me. It felt like a world where we stopped trusting each other. And I'll actually read a little bit of what Iain McGilchrist said you might expect to see if it was a world dominated by this analytic mode of the left hemisphere. He says, and I'll just read, this is a direct quote, an increasingly mechanistic, fragmented, decontextualized world marked by unwarranted optimism mixed with paranoia, which in itself, just that line is quite incredible. And a feeling of emptiness has come about, reflecting, I believe, the unopposed action of a dysfunctional left hemisphere. So, you know, it's a bit sobering reading that, and it's not the entire story by any means. And it's a bit like he's never down on the left hemisphere. He says it performs vital functions for us to be able to exist and get through our day. But I wonder whether we might be moving into territory of the second clip, which is on the matter and consciousness. So I wonder, is there anything else you want to say, Vajrajyoti, or should we move on to that second clip?
Well, just to say, I really like that line about paranoid, optimistic but paranoid world.
Yeah, unwarranted optimism mixed with paranoia.
Yep. I mean, whether it's global warming or the pandemic or practically anything else, we can feel that, and well, I can feel that in myself, and I can see that around me. Yeah. So maybe this might segue into the second clip, I think, Vajrajyoti, if you could play that.
I wonder if you could say more about consciousness. And I know that in the book you say that, well, we don't know whether consciousness is an emergent phenomenon of the brain or whether the brain is mediating consciousness. And of course, how can one be sure? But I wondered whether you as you know, as it were, off the record, have an opinion. Do you have a personal view as to which is more likely?
I certainly do. It is pretty much incoherent to imagine that consciousness somehow emanates out of matter. In fact, I adopt the view that matter is a phenomenon in consciousness, that the cosmos is conscious, and that matter is if you like, a phase of consciousness. I'm using the term in the scientific sense that, water has phases. In one, it's hard and solid and immobile and can break your head. In another, it's flowing and transparent. In another, it is invisible. So in this sense, I think that matter is an element of resistance in consciousness. And that takes me to another point, that one of the themes of the book is that resistance is very important for the coming about of anything at all, that it is in itself creative, that in a way, creation needs an element of resistance, and matter is a way of solidifying and slowing down the movement of spirit and energy and giving it form for a while. So I see it as, I mean, after all, in a very literal way, I know that I only know matter because of my consciousness. There's no question about that. But we don't know that I only know consciousness because of matter. I mean, that may be the case, or it may not. We don't know, but I have a very strong hunch that it can't possibly just be emanating. By the way, people like to talk about interconnections as being the point, that somehow when you reach a certain number of interconnections, billions of these, then you start to get consciousness. It may interest listeners to know that the cerebellum, which is the ancient part of the brain at the base of the brain and posterior in the skull, has 4 times as many neurons as the cerebrum on which consciousness depends. And it has an exponentially larger number of connections, but it cannot support consciousness. And it's also become obvious that creatures that don't have neurons have awareness, plants, for example.
Yeah, so that's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it, what he's saying? By the way, if you want to watch that again, because it's certainly worth watching a few times, I have. It's Bharati's, well, it's available. I'm not exactly where, but I'm sure Bharati will tell you later. Yeah. It's kind of mind-blowing, and it's so in accord with the Dharma at all levels, I guess, from the early Buddhist teachings to later Buddhist teachings. It's very in accord with some of them, and we might come to that a bit later. And Lokeshvara, I wonder what you make of this, like what it means to you. What is it? How do you make use of that kind of teaching?
I mean, the thing is, I can't know. I have no idea. I don't actually know what consciousness is. I have no idea whether it precedes matter. That there is obviously the Buddha had a very, very similar teaching, and one of the teachings that I try and reflect on is that the nidanas, the chain of causation, and in that teaching, consciousness precedes form. So it does seem to say what Iain McGilchrist is saying from his scientific study or whatever, or his philosophical reflections. I think I feel quite happy to take it on trust. I mean, that's all I can say, and actually live as if that is the case. And I think that there's a number of implications from that if I do that. I've been using a text, a Tibetan text recently, which it's based on the idea of shunyata, which, although it's translated as emptiness, actually means that nothing is fixed. And that text invites me to perceive the world as if it's a dream, as if it's ephemeral, as if it's like a rainbow. And so I just try and do that. I mean, I just try and do that. And I think that helps, just going back to the previous bit of conversation, like just to see even just being in a natural environment, you don't actually have to be somewhere incredibly wild and remote just to see the wonder of it all. You just need a tree basically in front of you, or you need a long view to a hill or something. So I do try and practice like that. One of my favorite poems from our teacher, Sangharakshita, is called Animist. And he, I mean, it's basically saying something very similar, which is he fears that we are over-operating on this left hemispheric function, that we've made the world look mean and small and lost the wonder of it all. And so I do try and not do that, and do try and see the wonder in it all, and try and see things as alive. And I think that this has implications then for how we behave, and ethics, and well, maybe that's a question for you, Vajrajyoti. I wonder whether by thinking of consciousness preceding matter, that actually has ethical implications.
I mean, yes, yes, and there's so many ways of thinking about those ethical implications. So, yeah, to go back to early Buddhism, the earliest teachings of the Buddha. So this is one way into your question, I guess. If we go to the Dhammapada, which I have here, Sangharakshita's translation. I mean, this will be familiar to many of you. You probably know what I'm going to read, but it's the first verses of the Dhammapada. I'll read it. Hopefully you'll get why. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs. So, I mean, that's so clear, isn't it? It is, in a way, saying, well, personally, we create our worlds. How we, what we do with our minds, although that's even, a bit of a paradox, that sentence, what we do with our minds, determines what our worlds are like. And if we act skillfully, as we say, then we will experience a more beautiful, satisfying, contented life, and so will the people around us. If we act unskillfully, the converse will happen to us and the world around us. So, in a way, that those verses from the Dhammapada are the foundations of our ethical practice. It's how we create our worlds. And to go back to my retreat experiences, and I'm sure this rings a bell with many of you, often when I'm on retreat, the world comes alive, especially the natural world. It's like everything looks and sounds different. Not just a little bit different, not just a little bit more beautiful, but as if, well, I don't know, it can't be put into words in a way, because the right brain isn't so great with words. One could, that simplistically it's not so great with words, but it's like the energy around me is apparent in everything I see and hear, rather than the matter involved in everything I see and hear. So and being on retreat, I think we do transform our minds, and therefore the world around us is also transformed and reflected back to us, and then that becomes a virtual circle. It continues. Whereas one point McGilchrist makes is left brain or left consciousness ways of thinking and seeing and acting also feed on each other, and that is why it's so dangerous for us and our cultures. What have you experienced that on retreat, or do you have a different way of talking about it or expressing it, Lokeshvara?
Well, one thing I really liked from that clip was when he used the idea of resistance and as a positive force. In other words, anything useful comes out of trying to meet resistance. In the long form interview, he unpacks that a little bit, talking about things that apparently are opposite, and how I mean, that's definitely a theme in my life, is recognizing, and some of you who know me know I talk about this a lot, recognizing the contradictions inherent in myself and in the world around me. And so when you meet something which seems to oppose what you want to do or where you want to go, you meet that resistance and you try and then find a higher synthesis. And you do need both. I think you do need both faculties, as it were. You actually do need some analytical component to understand something, but you also need that patterning mind to actually see the wonder and see the beauty. So I do. There is a forensic clarity that comes from analysis. So I do try and do that on retreat or in life, in meditation, but I always try and have as much as I can, a kind of overarching positive vision of life in which I can do that forensic analysis as much as I can do it. So I do try and have like as you talk about retreats, I do try and do a cloud watching practice. I try and do it outside of retreat as well. And it's a good test of my consciousness. Am I able just to sit and watch clouds actually moving in the sky? Like, because sometimes I try it and it's too painful for doing it for more than 10 seconds. And it means that I'm in this kind of, utilitarian, administrative type mode or something. And it's very difficult to get out of, but it's worth making the effort. And I think we relate to people better when we just make a little bit of effort to almost like just to widen the perspective.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's all I mean, there's lots more that we could say, but I wonder whether, how are we doing for time? Is it?
Time. I would just want.
Yeah.
I think you keep on emphasising, Lokeshvara, that actually we're not saying the left brain is bad. That we need to eliminate it somehow. But it's more that they need to be in more balance.
Yes.
And one of Iain McGilchrist's examples of that, it's just very simple, is if you watch a garden bird in the garden, it's both like pecking at the ground, very focused, because it needs to be very focused with its beak and its ears to hear the worms. And it also has a broad awareness, and you can see both these things happening if you watch a bird looking out for danger or predators. So the broad awareness, in the terms we're speaking of, is the right brain, I guess, that broad awareness that can, sky gaze. And the feeding brain, the listening for the worms side, is the left analytical, more focused brain. And a bird needs both, clearly, using that example. But we all need both, but they need to be working together. And actually, the point Iain McGilchrist makes is the left brain needs to be reminded that it's the servant, that's his language, of the right brain. It's so prone to thinking it knows everything.
Yes.
And he really emphasizes that not knowing is much more valuable and important than certainty.
Yeah.
If we think we know, it's not just deluded, it's dangerous for us and the people around us.
Yes.
At least the arguments, at least all sorts of
the only thing I'd like to add to that would be, I think he's quite clear that there is a direction of travel, because he says at one point the danger of saying that certainty is dangerous, which he does believe in and is true, can lead you to the postmodern position that there's no truth to be found anywhere. And he says no, but I think you can set a direction of travel. So even though you don't, there isn't a kind of certainty that you arrive at this place of perfection, you kind of know which way to orientate yourself. And actually that's an ethical path, and it's also a path of beauty. And I think that's important.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That is so helpful, isn't it? To encourage us to stay clear on our values, really, our ethics, about who we want to become, and set our course in that direction.
Listen, shall we just set up some breakout rooms so that you guys can talk about this as well? We just wanted to, give a little bit of conversation from our perspective from those clips, and just maybe give you a couple of questions, quite simple questions, just to start a conversation in breakout rooms. So shall I just, I think Vajrajyoti's going to put them in the chat, but I'll just read them out if you like. Is that helpful to read them out? Yeah. The first one is, well, how do you understand or do you recognize even those two modes from the first clip? Because that is his central thesis, isn't it? The left hemispheric functioning, the analytic mind, and the right hemispheric mind of intuition and imagination. So, and what does that mean for you? Quite simple, really. What does that mean for you? Did you recognize it in your experience, and what does it mean for you? And then the second question, we can't really know if consciousness precedes the so-called material world. I mean, Iain McGilchrist says he's pretty sure it does, but how would it be to live as if we were in a co-created relationship with everything outside of us, and with everything that's outside of us? So I think that's probably a nice way of putting this, this relationship between consciousness and matter, and especially with other people as well, thinking that we actually co-create everything that we are and everything that is in front of us. So anyway, there are two suggested questions, just to give a little bit of form, if you like, a little bit of structure to a conversation. And I think you're in breakout room